Dr. Jessica Melbourne-Thomas is a transdisciplinary researcher and knowledge broker with CSIRO Oceans and Atmosphere. Her research background is in mathematical modelling and Antarctic climate change science, and she was a lead author for the recent IPCC special report on the oceans and cryosphere in a changing climate. Jess co-founded the Homeward Bound project, which took the largest ever all-female expedition on a leadership journey to Antarctica in 2016. She was one of Australia's first 30 superstars of STEM and was named Tasmania's Young Tall Poppy of the Year in 2015 for her excellence in research, science communication and policy engagement. Her topic today is engagement, diversity and interdisciplinarity to tackle future challenges.
I would also like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land that we're meeting on today, the Muminina people, and to pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. So my talk this afternoon is very much focused towards the future and what might come next for science and for human and natural systems. And unfortunately, as I'm sure you're aware, that future is not looking so bright. I hesitated on whether to start my presentation with doom and gloom. I'm normally definitely a natural optimist, and I wear rose-coloured glasses when it comes to thinking about the future of the planet and the future of my kids. But in fact, this paper on understanding the challenges of avoiding a ghastly future, which generated quite a lot of media attention when it came out recently, actually urges scientists not to sugarcoat what our research is telling us about the likely future for our planet that's ahead. And as Mary mentioned, having worked as a lead author recently on a report for the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, it does seem that in many respects, our most recent science on climate change actually tells us that the situation is worse than we'd previously thought. So this latest United in Science report from the World Meteorological Association, which brings together the latest climate science from the WMO, the Global Carbon Project, UNESCO, the IPCC, UNEP and the Met Office, reported that there's a 1 in 4 chance that the global mean annual temperature will exceed 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels for at least 1 year over the coming 5 years. So what that translates as is that in less than 8 years since the Paris Agreement entered into force, we might be touching that first critical threshold of 1.5 degrees Celsius, which 189 countries are committed not to cross. Just last week, we published this paper led by Dana Bergstrom from the Australian Antarctic Division that identified evidence of ecosystem collapse in 19 different ecosystems across Australia, from the tropics right through to the Antarctic continent. And several of the systems we considered are absolutely iconic for Tasmania. And as someone who grew up bushwalking in the highlands and scuba diving in the giant kelp forests off the east coast, I think it's absolutely heartbreaking to see images like this of transformed ecosystems across very large spatial scales. So both in our ecosystem collapse paper and also in this Bradshaw et al. Paper on underestimating the challenges of a ghastly future, there's a range of options identified for changing course and for actually addressing biodiversity loss and also inequity. And so in the Bradshaw paper, these include abolishing the goal of perpetual economic growth, revealing the true cost of products and activities by forcing those who damage the environment to pay for its restoration, obviously rapidly eliminating fossil fuels, regulating markets by curtailing monopolisation, and the one at the bottom there, the last one I put in bold because it's particularly relevant to the themes of my talk today, and also noting that tomorrow is International Women's Day, that one of the things we need is to educate and empower women across the globe. And as I alluded to when I started my talk, these authors also urge scientists not to look away, not to sugarcoat the overwhelming challenges ahead, but instead to tell it like it is. And there's this quite strong quote from the authors that anything else is at best misleading and at worst potentially lethal for the human enterprise. So there's a role for scientists in telling it like it is, but I also think in talking about what a better future could look like and how we might get there. So my 3- and 5-year-old daughters are pretty convinced that when they grow up, they're going to go into space, and maybe that might be the best option for them. But rose-coloured glasses me likes to think that there might be a brighter future for them and for future generations here on Earth. So my presentation today is about some of the things that I think are critically important for science and scientists to help build a better, more sustainable and equitable future. These are things I think we can actually do to help work towards the Sustainable Development Goals. And so the things I'm going to talk about are engagement and communication, interdisciplinary approaches, decision support tools, helping to envision alternative futures, recognising the importance of different knowledge systems and supporting diversity and inclusion. And I wanted to emphasise that this is not by any means meant to be an exclusive list. It's just some of the things that I think can be effective and would like to see more of, and also things that I have some confidence to talk about given my own background. So the top of my list is engagement and communication, which is obviously critical to my current role with CSIRO. And I thought I'd start with a neat example that you might be familiar with, which is around how we might think differently about communication and help better engage people with the challenge of climate change. And so this Curious Climate Tasmania initiative came out of the Centre for Marine Socioecology here in Hobart, and it was born with the aim of catalysing climate conversations between scientists and the community by, if you like, flipping our conventional model of science communication on its head. And we were curious to know how people in local communities view climate change, whether they too are concerned or interested, whether they have questions about the scientific basis for climate change and its implications, and if so, what those particular questions might be. And our core aim really was to get local people in Tasmania talking about and engaging directly with climate researchers. So we had a partnership with ABC Hobart, which enabled us to co-design a project where we could engage a wide local audience by asking them what issues and questions they had and that they wanted to discuss, rather than us simply telling them about climate change. And the project was executed in a couple of phases, engagement over radio and then in person by a travelling roadshow. And it ran over the course of a couple of weeks in August 2019. And what that project revealed is that communities do want to know about climate change, but they also want information about what actions they can take. And by opening up those conversations, not only were we able to help create some level of trust, but also engender agency, if you like, to help empower change. The question of how we use scientific information to make decisions and change behaviour is, I think, a pretty universal one, and one where I think at least the conventional model of publishing scientific results in a peer-reviewed paper and hoping that someday, somewhere, someone might pick it up and use those results to inform a decision is probably not a useful one anymore. And so many of the challenges that science is working to address are becoming more urgent, and I think we're seeing increasing recognition of a role for knowledge translation in bridging this gap between evidence and practice. And so that's where knowledge brokering comes in. There's a range of different names and labels for knowledge brokering and knowledge brokers, things like boundary spanners, extension scientists and others. But this quote, I think, quite usefully captures the core function of a knowledge broker, which is about developing relationships and networks with, among and between producers and users of knowledge, in order to facilitate the exchange of knowledge throughout that network and build capacity for evidence-based decision-making. And so specifically, knowledge brokers can help in connecting researchers and decision-makers, helping researchers identify the most appropriate means to influence the decision-making process, translating research findings to suit user needs. We can even think about this as creating a new type of knowledge, brokered knowledge, and brokering knowledge and collaboration between scientific disciplines within research teams. Fairly fundamental to working with people in connecting science to impact is appreciating the importance of psychology. And as you're probably aware, cognitive bias is really fundamentally important in how we process information and make decisions. And this includes things like hindsight bias, where we imperfectly remember the past, and so we think that it was actually more predictable than it was. I put my hand up for being guilty of optimism bias. In salience bias, we have a tendency to fixate on the dramatic things, not the important details. And, and there are a couple there that are around framing and discounting bias, where, we find it difficult to connect with things that are further away. 95 of our decision-making uses System 1, or so-called fast thinking, which is instinctive, unconscious, automatic. But in bringing science into the decision-making process, we actually want to invoke that 5% of System 2 thinking, which is needed for complex decision-making. So I think that having a clearer appreciation of how our brains are wired and what that means for the way we process information is really critical for better science communication. I was asked if I could reflect on my year doing science communication as Tasmanian Australian of the Year, and here seemed like a sensible place to do it, given that much of my year was about engaging with people. A lot of that engagement turned out to be online, and to be honest, in a lot of ways that was actually a huge relief for me, because it meant that I didn't have to be away from my family, and I didn't have to make difficult decisions around accepting invitations to go places but then be away from home where I wanted to be. And I think that the move to virtual platforms driven by COVID has been really great to see in a lot of ways, not least because of the travel miles that we often expend as scientists, but also because of my own previous experience as a mum of very small children, being excluded from in-person meetings because I wasn't able to get approval to travel with a baby. And I've seen lots of examples this year where that barrier has just dissolved away. I absolutely appreciate it's not an equal playing field either in the online world, but I do think it's really constructive to see the shift and and our realisation during the pandemic that often virtual is a good option. My other honest reflections on my 2020 Australian of the Year experience include that, in general, I think it hasn't been one that has been particularly inclusive of people with caring responsibilities. Overwhelmingly, I attended events where there were no children present at all, which struck me as really strange, given that theirs is the future that we're trying to build. I also did a lot of thinking about the significance of the date on which we celebrate Australia Day, and I do think that it's important to properly recognise, as a society has done, the ongoing traumas associated with that particular date and other actions that have been taken for Indigenous Australians, and that one of those things includes changing the date. That said, it's been absolutely wonderful to see these 4 amazing and outspoken women recognised in 2021, and I'm full of admiration, anticipation and hope for all that they will continue to achieve, and what wonderful recognition for diversity and inclusion in Australia. So, shifting gear a little, the next item on my list for roles for science and scientists is interdisciplinary approaches. And there are a bunch of different definitions around these terms. This is the one that I find particularly helpful because I think it usefully distinguishes between multidisciplinary approaches, where we have cooperation between different disciplines that are working towards different research goals, but maybe under one thematic umbrella, if you like, which is really quite different from interdisciplinary research that actually integrates the different disciplines to work towards a single research goal. And then transdisciplinary approaches are a variant around that, or an extension, if you like, where some of the research participants actually bring in a non-research body of knowledge, which might be industry knowledge, it might be local and traditional knowledge, or it might be policy knowledge. And that process is often referred to as knowledge co-production. We've been collecting some data from within CSIRO about different features of these multi, inter and transdisciplinary research projects and how they map onto this two-dimensional space, which has as its x-axis the research mode, which ranges from, on the left-hand side, a single dominant discipline and more technical scientific knowledge, to the right-hand end where we're looking at multiple disciplines, multiple forms of knowledge, real collaboration and emergent and novel practices. And then the y-axis is capturing aspects of the problem itself. And so at the bottom there, we have problems with, compartmentalised, reasonably easily discernible solutions, through to, at the top, truly complex problems with high disagreement and no right answer. And the blue dots that are overlaid are example projects where we collected information, and I guess unsurprisingly the take-home message here is that doing this work takes a lot of time. But that once that research reaches its capacity, the impact on those complex problems is high. One of the key things that I think inter and transdisciplinary research can help deliver to achieve impact is decision support tools, which is the next item on my list. And given that my background is in modelling and decision support, this seemed like an appropriate spot to acknowledge some of my key sources of inspiration. And on the day before International Women's Day, I'm really delighted to acknowledge these amazing female mentors who have been and continue to be so important for my career development. So you may know some of these faces. Beth Fulton is on the left there, Greta Peckel, Eva Plagani, Julia Blanchard, Deb O'Connell and Ingrid Van Putten. And I also wanted to acknowledge and thank Andrew Constable and Craig Johnson, who are at the top, who have not only been incredibly important to me as mentors and champions, but who also play an extremely active and important role in creating opportunities more generally for women in STEM. And so a lot of the things that are in my talk today come from this, the kinds of conversations that I've been able to have with this incredible brain's trust and the things they've inspired me to think about. So ecosystem models can be virtual worlds for understanding change and exploring mechanisms, and can act, Beth Fulton describes them helpfully, I think, as flight simulators for exploring possible outcomes from different decision pathways and management strategies. And this is the summary graphic from NOAA showing the various components of the Atlantis end-to-end ecosystem model that Beth developed, and which has now been used in more than 30 systems around the world, ranging from small estuaries to large ocean regions, to address questions around fisheries management, climate change impacts, and other facets of how marine ecosystems function and how they're used. And so I guess this is really just to highlight that we talk about Atlantis as an end-to-end model because it encapsulates really everything in the system, right through from the physical drivers to the ways that humans interact with ecosystems. So envisioning alternative futures was the next item on my list, and models are certainly an important tool to help support that. But I did want to talk more generally about some of the approaches that we use to envisage different futures and to consider pathways and actions we might need to take to reach a more desirable future. And so this is another example that comes from the Centre for Marine Socioecology, where we've been running quite a unique collaborative project called Future Seas, which involves over 100 researchers from a whole range of disciplines. I have them all listed here: psychology, public health, philosophy, oceanography, economics, social science, engineering, ICT, governance, law and policy, and actually really importantly, traditional and Indigenous knowledge holders. And so in Future Seas, we used a strategic technique called Foresighting to develop interdisciplinary, evidence-informed, plausible scenarios of the future by 2030 for a range of different challenges that are facing the world's oceans. And for each of those challenges, we articulated a business as usual future, which is where we're currently heading if not much changes, and then a technically possible, more sustainable future. So what could we achieve if we use the knowledge and technology that we have available? And one of the really great things about this project actually is that we've had a very high level of leadership from early career researchers in the project, which has been a great opportunity for them. So this is the general foresighting process that kind of underpins Future Seas, which I think is quite a powerful tool for developing strategies and pathways towards different scenarios by considering current trends, developing scenarios, and then actually testing strategies against those scenarios. And these are the 12 challenges that we've considered as part of the project, ranging from climate change through to ocean literacy, ocean governance, the blue economy, and an Indigenous-led paper on empowering her guardians to nurture our future ocean. And this is a photo of a good chunk of the team that we've been working with. One of the things that we try to do as part of Future Seas is to develop visual representations of alternative futures, which links back to points around being creative in how we can communicate our science. And this is an example for the climate change mitigation and adaptation challenge, where we have a visualisation of a business as usual future on the left and a more sustainable future on the right. And I should say that we use 2030 as our time frame for all of Future Seas because it aligns with the UN International Decade of Ocean Science for Sustainable Development. And so one of the directions we're hoping to explore leading on from this work is how we can use other forms of interactive engagement like virtual reality to help people visualise and connect with these different futures. I've used this graphic a few times over the last year. It's from a tool that was on the ABC News website for a while, where you could enter your date of birth and then look at projected changes in temperature over what might be your lifetime for here a high emission scenario, which is the grey bars, and then another scenario in red, which is where we're able to limit warming within a reasonably safe amount. This is 1.5 degrees. And so I guess my point here is that there are a huge range of really excellent tools like this to help us think about the future. Some are quite confronting, like I think this one is, which may not always be the best option, but which certainly has impact. And we sometimes hear criticisms around the way that climate change science is communicated, and I absolutely think we still have a lot to learn, but there's been so much progress and some really innovative thinking in how we can help people connect to something, how we can help people connect something large-scale, intangible and frightening like climate change to their individual experiences and the way that individuals think about the future. And of course, concepts of the past and the future and even time vary between cultures. And so I was actually quite fascinated to learn that, contrary to our modern European concepts of leaving the past behind us, ancient, and you may know, ancient and Indigenous languages walk backwards through time. And it seems to me that appreciating that there are very different concepts of time and how we might think about and manage for the future is really important in terms of finding equitable solutions that recognise other ways of knowing. And so that's actually my next point on my list of roles for science and scientists. And we're seeing increasing evidence that adopting this so-called two-eyed seeing actually two-eyed seeing promotes coexistence of Indigenous knowledge and Western science, as opposed to a singular view or one in which Indigenous knowledge is assimilated by Western science. That's really important and powerful for achieving better outcomes for sustainability and equity, both in the knowledge space and in the decision space. And this is another, I think, quite powerful way of visualising this as the weaving of different knowledge systems, which in this figure actually also includes things like citizen science and practitioners' knowledge and technical knowledge. And then we can develop an enriched picture that can connect through a collaborative process, both with the problem framing and in finding solutions and pathways forward. And indeed, recent global assessments like the IPBES Global Assessment for Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services identify important advantages to this kind of approach. So the final item on my list for roles for science and scientists is about supporting diversity and inclusion. And I left this one till last because for me, it really has been underpinning for my career journey and opportunities. And so as you heard in 2014, I was very fortunate to co-found the Homeward Bound program for women in science and leadership. And in fact, Homeward Bound itself stemmed from some other work earlier in 2014 to establish an international network for women in polar science, which is still going and currently has over 4,500 members. So Homeward Bound is about building a global community to elevate the voices of women in science, particularly in the context of climate change. And in 2016, we sent the largest ever all-female voyage on a leadership journey to Antarctica, and there have been 3 voyages since then. And importantly, I think Homeward Bound has been part of a whole wave of initiatives targeted around promoting diversity and inclusion in STEM. But there is still quite a long way to go, and there's certainly a risk that the impacts of the pandemic will force us backwards rather than forwards. And this has been highlighted recently in reports from the Chief Scientists, the Australian Chief Scientist's Office, as well as analyses in the international peer-reviewed literature. So at the risk of preaching to the converted, I think it is worth emphasising why diversity and inclusion are so important for science, particularly in the context of our capacity to address the global challenges ahead of us. And so beyond just the importance of equal opportunities, of course, we see evidence that diverse groups publish more frequently and are cited more, that they can have obviously complementary skill sets, that diverse groups are better equipped to consider inequity and to act on that. And also, I quite like this last point, that intersectionality allows us to highlight and enrich our overlapping identities. So putting it all together then, I think that to address future challenges we need engagement and communication to help connect science to user needs and to decision making. That interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary approaches can help us address complex multidimensional problems and build capacity. And of course, in saying that, I'm not indicating that there's not an ongoing and critically important role for single discipline and multidisciplinary science, just that for those large-scale complex problems, these are likely the approaches that we're going to need to see more of. Decision support tools help us meet user needs around managing risk. Helping to envision alternative futures can support adaptation planning and pathways and identify actions towards a preferred scenario. Recognising the importance of different knowledge systems gives us an enriched picture and equitable solutions through weaving together different knowledge streams. And finally, supporting diversity and inclusion can provide us with more equitable, innovative science. So as I said at the beginning, that list is not meant to be exhaustive. It's just a reflection of the things that have been central for me over my career journey so far. And as much as I'm intrigued by the possibility of human civilization on other planets, I think we have something pretty special right here that is worth protecting for future generations. Happy International Women's Day for tomorrow, and thank you once again for the invitation to speak today.
Thank you very much, Jess. And I'm happy to say we do have time for some questions, and we have a couple of people with roving microphones so that your question can be heard by everybody. So if you have a question for Jess, please raise your hand, and Adele and Shasta will bring a microphone to you. Thank you, Hilary. Yes.
In your engagement and communication, did you ever manage to talk to the politicians? Because it seems to me that it's got to be politically driven by, preferably by non-party lines, by enlightened and people who have got this knowledge that you're communicating.
Yes, and I agree that's a very important point. And yes, some limited opportunity to talk to politicians, particularly last year through the Australian of the Year program. You know, one of the things that I'm finding more and more just as I work in this space is that there's so many layers of decision making, and, you know, depending on the question, there are strategies around usefully targeting your effort at those different levels. So doing a lot more work directly with departments, for instance, is something that I'm finding quite fulfilling and is achieving change. But I agree that, you know, we probably need more of, and actually Science Meets Parliament I think just happened last week, so I haven't heard about how that went, but more of that is very important, I agree.
Thank you. Andrew.
Earlier on in your presentation, you mentioned this idea of knowledge brokers. I was interested to get a bit of a feel for that. So people working in those roles, working in a role like that, would you see them based within like research institutions like uni and CSIRO, or government department, private sector? where would you see them fitting in?
Everywhere, I think. I had a great conversation earlier in the week about the nuance around what we actually mean, and that, you know, it actually really is a spectrum that relates to the context and the problem, and that then an individual is not going to manage to do all of that. But I think we are actually, as I said, there's different labels being used. Extension scientist is one that seems to be popular. I think they use that in the US a bit, but more organisations do seem to be identifying the need for these knowledge broker roles, and I think we can probably get better at articulating exactly what context they'll work in, and therefore what skills they'll need to, you know, to perform in that particular position. But yeah, I'd say we need them everywhere.
Thank you, Jess. Professor Lickis?
Just following on Dr. Wallace's comment, do you have a sort of a partner in the universe that can match your modelling with the model of how obstacles arise and how they are interlinked? Because Parliament, in one sense, would reflect ultimately the pressures being put on them by a far more better quality understanding of the complexity of the oppositions to these things.
Do you mean barriers in a kind of policy and legislative sense?
Yes, the obstacles, for example, in your moving from the sea as it is and the sea that it will be unless something's done, to what is possible. I mean, it strikes me that an equally complex and adequate model is needed of where is the opposition, and what are the interaction between the various factors. Yeah, that requires a lot of understanding.
Yeah, absolutely. And I didn't go into detail in that example of Future Seas of how we thought about barriers, but we did certainly discuss where those important, you know, choke points might exist, and whether what we were mapping out properly took those into account. But I think that is a more general point and an important one, and certainly from my experience working more in these interdisciplinary teams, which include people with direct expertise in policy and governance, helps a lot in bringing that perspective. You know, as natural scientists, I think, you know, we're often just completely naive as to what the landscape actually looks like, you know, in terms of what is possible and what might be required in terms of, you know, true change in legislation and regulation and policy making. And so I think that's another key part of doing this, for me at least, this interdisciplinary work, is to bring people together who have that expertise.
Thank you. Yes, thank you, Professor Lickis.
I'm very dumb about this. What is ocean literacy?
Yeah, another great question, and if you're interested in having someone speak about ocean literacy, I can make some recommendations. It's a fascinating topic. It's basically, you know, people's knowledge of the ocean and why it's important and how well they connect to it. And, you know, we talk a lot about the fact that really the ocean is our buffer against climate change, in that it's absorbing so much of the extra heat and carbon dioxide, and also provides so many other important resources. But it's distant, you know, we can't see what's under the water, and people don't naturally connect. I think Tasmania is a little bit of a case apart, actually, because we are so connected, at least to our coastal environments. But in general, there's a need to help people better connect to the ocean, know more about it, and hence, you know, seek change in the way that we manage it. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you. Other questions? Yep, thank you.
Thanks a lot. Yeah, I was interested in your comments about Indigenous knowledge, how that might be used, and obviously we're hearing about their knowledge in fire management. Can you give us any other examples that relate to climate change? I mean, they've had a history of 40,000 or so years, so if they can transfer that knowledge, down through the generations, they should have a much better picture of climate change.
That's right, and I think you make a really important point there that certainly Australian Aboriginal people have literally lived through climate change, although what we're seeing now is on much faster timescale than they've experienced previously. I think kind of as a general response in terms of the work that I'm starting to do more with traditional owners in the context of climate change is that there's just such a fundamentally different way of connecting to and caring for country that, and that we are seeing that translate not just in Australia but in many other places as successes for biodiversity recovery, through Indigenous managed protected areas, for instance, both in the ocean and on land. But I think part of it is techniques like fire management, and part of it is just a very different way of thinking about how we connect with and preserve landscapes and diversity.
Thank you. I have a question about the psychological aspects you mentioned in your talk, Jess, that scientists are usually in the business of transmitting facts, but when it comes to knowledge brokering, they have to understand the biases, etc., of the users of that knowledge or the other stakeholders. So is that emphasis on human psychology, is that something that science communicators are now trained in, or is it something that you pick up as you go?
Yeah, good question. I can't think of any particular training programs I know of that talk about that directly, but certainly there's an increasing movement, if you like, to be at least aware of cognitive bias in the ways that we approach science communication. But I think there is a bit of a disconnect in terms of the way we train scientists generally to present their work and in fact what's needed to gain the skills to communicate with people in a way that's not only meaningful but can actually help reframe ideas and get people to act and behave differently. That's another question again. So yes, excellent point. We should be embedding psychology into science communication training.
Thanks, Jess. Are there any other questions before we finish? Jocelyn, thank you.
Jess, I'm just a bit concerned, or not concerned, but I want to ask the question about how much of your focus on transdisciplinarity and the way you communicate as scientists is a sort of Western affluent preoccupation, and one that has very little relevance to most of the world's population. Most of the people of the world today live in poverty and have very few choices, and their highest priority is simply food to eat and somewhere to live.
Yes, great question, Jocelyn, thank you. And I actually think that, if anything, these transdisciplinary approaches and better understanding ways that we can engage and help create change is most important in those places. And just earlier in the week I was talking with colleagues from CSIRO who are working in Papua New Guinea around some of those questions and developing a program to train local knowledge brokers that work with local government agencies and NGOs to help find ways to do that, so that it's that it is meaningful and it isn't necessarily based completely on our privileged Western developed country model. So I think you raise a very important point, but I wouldn't say that certainly those that I work with are unaware that we need to be making sure that we're building capacity, not just preaching a perfect way to approach the problem.
Thank you. And I'd like to ask Jocelyn to come down now. Professor Jocelyn McPhee is our Vice President of the Royal Society, and she'll propose a vote of thanks to Jess, if you'd like to stay here for a minute, Jess. And I'd like to take the opportunity to thank Shasta and Adele for being our roving microphone holders. Thank you very much.
Stand here. Okay. So it's a huge treat to have you here and speak to us today, Jess, and I know everybody will really appreciate the effort that you've gone in preparing your presentation. But I'd also like to say that it takes a lot of courage to do what you've done, and that is to step away from a conventional and secure research single discipline pathway to this much more complicated and challenging transdisciplinarity. For a start, you've got to learn how to say that. And I really admire you for showing that courage. Not too many people would be prepared to take up that challenge. So thank you very much, and we have a small gift as a memory, I guess, of this event, and to thank you for all your time and effort.
Thank you very much. Thank you.